You've all read the headlines that inflation is rising in India. But we today want to talk about why this is happening, and more importantly, what are the metrics in India. To talk about all of this and much more, I have with me the ex-Chief Economic Advisor of India, KV Subramanian. Sir, we appreciate you taking our time and joining us here on CNN News 18. Let's first talk about the most latest numbers. The wholesale price-based inflation spiked to about a record high, as I said, of over 15%. And if you compare that to what we saw in March or April last year, that was just about 10.74%. So I want to first begin by understanding, what do you see as the biggest cause?
So first, Ridhima, I think we have to be careful to understand that it is the CPI inflation that monetary policy tracks, number one. Number two, it is the CPI inflation that the consumer faces. So I think, we should not be tracking, WPI inflation. It does contribute to CPI inflation, and that so in that sense, I think it's important. But from the consumer's perspective and from the monetary policy perspective, it is CPI inflation. And I think what you have to keep in mind is, if you look at the CPI inflation globally, the United States, which has typically always had 2% CPI inflation, is now facing 8.5%. That is almost 5 times as much, right? 4.5 to 5 times, which is a 40-year high. United Kingdom is facing inflation. Again, I'm using all CPI inflation here because that's the right measure. The United Kingdom is facing inflation that is a 30-year high. Germany, 26-year high. These are the advanced economies. If you look at even France, actually, I know very high inflation as well. If you look at some of the emerging economies, Turkey, as part of OECD, has 70% inflation. That's the latest print, 70%. Argentina, 60% inflation. Brazil, 12%. So I think, when you think about actually policy, role of policy, what are factors that are contributing in a way that you can do nothing about, is something that has to be kept in mind. Global factors like this, which is basically influencing inflation, I think has to be recognized. Second, when you look at retail inflation itself, there is, not just India, but elsewhere as well, there is the impact of COVID policy itself, which was COVID policy just Keynesian demand priming, or were there supply side measures, what was the amount of money creation that happened? That's one part to this inflation scenario. And second, the war that is happening. If you look at the CPI inflation, food inflation is the biggest contributor, about 45%. Of which edible oils are actually contributing, about 20%. And this is primarily because, Indonesia, for instance, has imposed an export ban. Today, I think they're in the process of maybe unwinding some part of it, which will be good news. But sunflower oil, for instance, which, Ukraine was a big exporter of, actually has also contributed. And so overall, these are some of the important factors, which, as it turns out, actually are beyond India's control. And we have to look at these in a comparative sense and focus on CPI inflation.
Okay, fair enough. Let's actually talk about what is hitting the common man and the middle class, which is the inflation in food articles. That was about 8.35%. There has been a fair share of criticism against the government. So I want to understand, do you think the government could have been more proactive in steps to contain the spike?
When we talk about the role of governments, I think let's be pragmatic here. Do you think that the United States actually, if it had all the policies to be able to control inflation, would have had, almost 5 times as much inflation as it basically has historically had? Or a UK, which is at a 30-year high, or a Germany, I think we have to recognize that no government has a magic wand. I think, and especially factors that are beyond a government's control. And when these are especially global factors, I think a government can do nothing about global factors. We have to recognize that. So, would you basically say that, the US, UK, Germany, all these governments have been behind the curve? No, it is because COVID created a lot of supply side restrictions, which basically has reduced supply globally in the economy, which has raised commodity prices. India, if anything, is far better. As I showed you, up until December, for instance, which was all because of COVID, the numbers after that is because of the war as well. Inflation actually barely exceeded 6%, despite a huge supply side shock that COVID has created. So I think India has been singularly distinguished in a positive sense in the way we've responded to COVID, actually in enhancing supply and being very prudent on the, on the revenue side, on demand as well. So I think, you have to give credit where it's due. At the same time, also recognize that there are factors that are beyond a government's control. Now, in the medium term, though, and I think that's something which we have to look at, I've always mentioned that, given that 50% of inflation in India, CPI inflation, comes from food inflation, of which two key factors basically contribute, which is, pulses and oil seeds. And these in turn, actually inflation in them comes primarily from the supply side. So in the medium term, we have to keep focusing on the supply, enhance domestic supply, encourage crop diversification so that we have more supply of both oil seeds and of pulses. And at the same time, also follow predictable, policies on the imports and sort of go into contractual, relationships with countries that can actually provide us oil seeds and pulses till our domestic supply increases. So these are some of the medium-term measures that, that have to be put in place, going forward.
Okay, I actually want to now talk about the road ahead and the measures that we can see to try and contain the spike. One, of course, is what the central bank can do, and we did see this with the RBI in that surprise move where it actually hiked interest rate by 0.40%. I now want to understand, seeing this trend and pattern, do you actually see the central bank and the RBI raising further interest rates in the forthcoming July and August policy as well? And could we actually reach the pre-pandemic level of about 5.15%?
No, I think again, what is important, and this I want to communicate to the viewer, that we have to be careful about ensuring that what are aspects that policy can do something about. Do keep in mind that when we think about India, and the Indian realities, a couple of key things that need to be kept in mind when we think about monetary policy and the inflation output trade-off. First, whenever the Reserve Bank raises rates, banks pass on that rate immediately to the borrowers. But when the Reserve Bank actually cuts rates, Indian banks do not pass it on actually to the borrower. And this has been acknowledged by many deputy governors and governors in their speeches about this asymmetry, which means that if we basically have 100 basis point policy rate increase and then 100%, let's say 100 basis points decline, let's say, what you will have is that borrowing rates will be higher than what we started from now, and that will have an impact on investment. And this is the other nuance that I don't see oftentimes in a lot of commentary, even from economists, which is distinguishing between investment demand and consumption demand. And while investment clearly depends on borrowing, because if borrowing rates go up, investment will definitely decline, and there will be an impact on output. When it comes to consumption, only durable goods consumption, for instance, housing, cars, motorbikes, etc., which basically are consumed using loans, only those consumption of that will go down. Food consumption, for instance, is not going to be impacted by lending rates or a change in the monetary policy rate by the Reserve Bank. So these are important trade-offs that we must keep in mind, and therefore actually the Reserve Bank will have to do a very, very tightrope walking to ensure that the emphasis on growth, the recovery from COVID, which is driven by private investment, is actually balanced with the inflation concerns, keeping in mind the bluntness of some other tools actually in being able to impact inflation. I think this is something which is very crucial.
One of the most evidently seen consequences of this rising inflation has been the impact on currency. A falling rupee is never good news. I want to understand now from you, where do you see the rupee settling?
Well, I typically never ever speculate on the price level of anything in a market. I think anybody who pretends that they actually can predict the prices, rather than predicting it, they would, go and trade on it, be basically, billionaires or millionaires. So I don't think in any market you can actually predict prices. It is, I think, it is a completely futile exercise. What we can do is to actually, avoid the volatility there. I think, the exchange rate is determined by market factors, but I will point out, and this is something which I think, a lot of commentators oftentimes selectively miss, which is, in the previous crisis, which was the global financial crisis, the currency declined by 56%. The depreciation was 56%. In contrast, if you look up till December, which was basically the, I sort of use as a cut off for looking at the impact of COVID, the depreciation was 0.06%. So that tells you about actually not just that, if you looked at inflation there, the fact that current account deficit was 6% then in the previous crisis, it was current account surplus, all tells you how the policy, Indian government policy during COVID was far more prudent. And that has indeed actually provided space to the central bank to be able to continue the accommodative stance. Going forward also, they have to keep this in mind and be very careful to not cut paste policies that are being done by the advanced economy. If you look at India's COVID policy, it was not a cut paste. We were singularly different in a positive way, by not mimicking advanced economies. Other emerging economies just mimicked the advanced economies, which we did not. And I think that playbook, which is thinking ab initio for ourselves, is something that is very critical going forward as well.
Okay. Lastly, sir, I want to understand what about the growth forecast, and the reason that I'm asking is because we're already seeing some slashes that are being announced, especially with the likes of S&P that has now cut it, the FY23 India growth forecast to about 7.3%. Do you agree with those levels?
I think bottom line, India will still continue to be the country with the highest growth rate. There is absolutely no denying that. In an environment where, I think with lockdown, etc., China possibly, growth rate might be in a recession, hard to tell, because we don't even know what is the extent of the problem there. And the United States, possibly being in a recession, and maybe even Europe. I think in such a scenario, even with a slightly, reduced growth rate because of some of the inflation, the measures taken from that side and the impact on investment, I think India still will be, the country where the growth will actually be by far the most, and India will be one of the key contributors to global growth, in this year and going forward as well.
Fair enough. We'll leave the conversation there. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for taking our time.
My pleasure.